Welcome to Kentucky Tonight. Good evening. I'm Bill Goodman. Tonight we'll discuss the state budget. Our guests are Sheila Schuster, Executive Director of the Advocacy Action Network, Terry Brooks, Executive Director of Kentucky Youth Advocates, Warren Rogers, Chair of the Kentucky Club for Growth, and Rand Paul, Chair of the Kentucky Taxpayers United. Thank you all for being here to discuss the state budget, and thank you for joining us from across the state of Kentucky. Dr. Paul, how would you respond to a state budget? You've studied, been in Kentucky a number of years. You rate legislators. You take a look at the fine wording of a state budget. What does it look like to you, and what's it supposed to do?
Well, I would take one step even further back and say, before you start saying how we're going to spend it, we need to have an overall or an underlying philosophy of what government should do. You need to ask, what is the proper role of government? You need to also understand that everything we spend, we're not just divvying up the spending. The other half of it is you don't have it unless you tax people. So you always have to ask, first of all, if you're worried about they're not spending enough, you have to ask yourself, well, are my taxes too low or too high? You know, as I go around the state, I rarely meet anybody that says, you know what, my taxes are too low. I really need to have my taxes increase and spend more at the state level. So I think that gets back to what is the fundamental role of government. And do we want a government that coddled us from, cradle to grave, or do we want a government that does the least that it has to do? I mean, that was the Jeffersonian idea, was that government is best that governs least. So we start with that it's the people's money, that you work hard for it, and we should take as little from people as possible. And then when we do it, we should spend it very efficiently and not waste it.
Do you think the very diligent employees of state government who work in the state budget office that are working on these kinds of crunching numbers and putting together graphs and charts, and do they look at it philosophically, or is it just a job to them? And do legislators look at it from what is a state budget supposed to do?
I would say neither look at it that way, and it may not be the job of the state bureaucrats to look that way. It is a job of the legislators to decide what we should be doing with government and move it forward. But I think they're all sort of timid, even among the legislature, in deciding, because everybody's gnashing their teeth and we don't have enough money and the money is a shortfall. And some of it's true and some of it's not even true. Sometimes we have a shortfall and 3 months later we don't have a shortfall. But some of it will be true, and we are in bad economic times now, and so you just have to acknowledge, that's the first thing you have to acknowledge. When I talk to people in my office and they say they're hurting their personal budgets down, they reduce their spending. Just no question. They don't have a choice. State government's got to do the same, and you do have to reduce spending. You try to cut the things that are easiest to cut, and you try to do the best you can. I think we put off some problems, like the pension problem. We sort of pushed it along for a later date, but it'll come back and it'll be a problem again within 5 years probably.
Dr. Paul, is that the way you
Yeah, and I think what you get, the argument from legislators, both at the federal and the state level, is, oh, everything's tied up. We have like 3% that we can even work with. Everything's spent. Everything's guaranteed. And to me, I think that's a little bit of a cop-out. It means that they're not really thinking creatively about the solutions for this. And we mentioned Medicaid earlier when we were talking before this. Someone has to think about some creative solutions. But you have to think about how you distribute products effectively. And it gets back to sort of capitalism. You can get a cell phone for $14. You can get 6 contact lenses, which is part of health care, for $20, sometimes $19. The marketplace works when something costs something and it's distributed in the marketplace. Government distributes goods and services very poorly. All you have to do is look at Katrina and FEMA, and they couldn't even distribute water. The government is notoriously inept at distributing goods and services. So that's why you want government always to distribute the very least amount of goods and services that you possibly can, even in a disaster. I'd much rather, if I had $10,000 in my taxes, give it to the Salvation Army than the government, because I know it'll be wasted by the government. Some people say it adds a third of the cost to a school. You build an elementary school and it costs $500,000, $100,000 of that or so is prevailing wage. Well, I think it's a mistake to legislate morality or health from the state. And, if you really want to say what's killing more people, smoking or overeating, it's overeating. So let's go for that tax on McDonald's next. Let's go tax all the people who aren't exercising. I mean, we don't really want a nanny state. I mean, people in a free society, people make bad decisions sometimes. Smoking's a bad decision to make. So's eating too much.
But who is saying?
I don't think that's true anyway, because even if you keep all of your rates the same, your revenue goes up. You look at the last 20 years of state government, revenue has gone up, spending has gone up on average 5.6% over the last 8 years. There have been a couple of years when it's been lower than that, but it's 5.6%. So when you lose 3%, you're not jockeying for the funds enough because it's going up 5.6% a year. As Warren mentioned earlier, that you don't encourage industry by having higher taxes, you encourage new industry by having lower taxes. There's an interesting lesson from the 80s that still most people don't understand. When we lowered marginal income tax rates, revenue did go up. So everybody said, oh, supply side didn't work because the deficit went up. The reason the deficit went up during the 80s with Reagan is because they spent to high heaven. They never cut any spending. Politicians can never cut spending. They can cut taxes. But when they did cut taxes in the 80s, revenue rose. So you can have more revenue for state government by cutting taxes. You might go from a 6% income tax to a 5% income tax and raise more money because more people come in. But really, you're competing with zero. Tennessee's got zero income tax. So you've got to come way down on your taxes. And we do all kinds of crazy stuff where we give millions of dollars to these industries, but then if you're an industry here, you still have high taxes. Once you've been here a few years, you're loaded on with high taxes. But we do all this stuff to beg and plead and try to bribe other industries to come in, but we then tax the heck out of the rest of us who are here.
So going up.
But you don't always get better just by throwing more money at it. Look, who spends more per pupil than any other state in the whole country? Washington, D.C., and most people wouldn't send their kids to school in Washington, D.C. They spend $13,000 per pupil. So throwing more money at it doesn't always make it better. Right. Well, I think that it's important that when we frame this debate or have this debate...
I need you to support that program.
I get more than a yes or no. When we frame a debate like this, I think it's very important that it doesn't get framed that I'm either for or against this home, which sounds like it does good things. The Presbyterians have the Bellwood home, does great things for kids too. If you came to me as a venture capitalist and said, we need $100,000, will you give it to a government program that sounds pretty good, or to the Bellwood home, I'd give it to the Bellwood, because I would give it to a private much more readily than the government. Salvation Army, the head of the Salvation Army makes $12,000 a year. I mean, what a wonderful grade. He's an ex-executive, he doesn't need the money, and they just pay sort of the expenses. Head of United Way makes $350,000 a year and has his own Learjet that he flies on. There are good charities and not so good charities, but all private charities are better than government charities because they're more efficient. If you look at the donations when we had the tidal wave in the South Pacific, more private money was given than government money. If you look at Katrina, there was more private donations than even the $60 billion that was given of federal money. We're a very generous country, and I think we can take care of those in our society who are the have-nots, the can-nots, the mentally ill that cannot do things. I think we're an incredibly prosperous and generous society, and I think we can take care of them without government.
Dr. Paul, are you suggesting then that of the government programs that you've read about that have been cut severely in this state budget that goes into effect tomorrow, are you proposing or suggesting that private dollars take care of the shortfall in some of these departments in cabinet?
I'm proposing that they will in many instances, and I think there are ways to encourage that too. I mean, there are ways to encourage it by giving people tax deductions and things like that for giving to charity and encouraging that, but there are just wonderful charities throughout our state that are doing a lot of these things. So you mentioned faith-based, intermingling government and faith-based, and George Bush did that. I think it was a horrible mistake. One, I think the money sort of pollutes the mission of a purely Christian organization or Muslim or whatever organization it is, and it obscures the church-state separation that there really ought to be. We shouldn't have tax money flowing into churches, and we should let churches do charity work, and that's wonderful, but they shouldn't be corrupted with government money.